Hello everybody, this is Mr. Rader back for another participation in government video. This one is looking at surveys and specifically looking at establishing correlations among variables when building knowledge for the field research component of the quality of life innovations proposal. We'll focus specifically on how to do contextualization as our social studies practice and really thinking about how to establish relationships amongst our variables to help us answer our field research question. Please remember that the survey is due tomorrow, January 13th. You should have between 10 and 15 questions in total. Should have about 4 or 5 demographic questions, and feel free to use the 2 sample demographic questions given to you in the lesson on survey traps. You should have between 2 and 3 behavioral questions, 2 and 3 knowledge questions, and 2 and 3 attitudinal questions. So the opening question I'm going to ask my students in class is which of those social science attributes are being measured in the statement below. So it says, how many hours do you spend a day on an electronic device? For example, a cell phone, a TV, or a computer. It's really measuring behavior because it's asking, what are you doing and how often do you do it? So with that in mind, when we think about correlations, maybe there are some connections between different types of variables when doing social science research. So for example, if we look at the time that we spend on our electronic devices, we could look at that with the kind of job that one might have. And we could look at it also within the idea of a knowledge question concerning symptoms of eye strain when we spend too much time looking at screens. So perhaps one of my predictions or hypotheses are that individuals who work in offices tend to spend more of their time on screens as part of their work. And when compared to, say, somebody who works in construction, who tends to work with tools out in the field based on their job. And this may be true, it may not be true. The office worker may be engaged in a lot of meetings throughout the day and may not be looking at their screens that much at all. And they may not look at the screens at all at night, whereas the construction worker may have their eyes glued on their cell phone every chance that they can get to log into social media or check the news or check email or check a text message, so on and so forth. And they may be on it all the time when they get home. You don't really know until you actually collect data to answer that question by seeing, based on the demographic that people identify, how much time they spend on their electronic device. So with that in mind, we want to consider how finding correlations across different kinds of variables can help us to build knowledge. So in the first activity, we're going to take a look at the survey questions, and we're going to try to explain the rationale for comparing the two variables. So for the first one, we look at a behavior and a knowledge, right? How often do you cycle? And your knowledge of bicycle safety precautions. So again, one might assume that the more often a person rides their bicycle, they will probably be more knowledgeable about bicycle safety precautions, perhaps because they've had accidents in the past, or they're trying to be proactive and prevent accidents because they know they're going to be riding on city streets where it might be potentially dangerous. So for this next set of potential correlations, we have how many pets do you own and what is your religious affiliation? So what I want to call out here is notice first off that the social science attribute is the same. So it doesn't really help us to establish anything because a person can own 0 pets, 2 pets, 20 pets, and it's not going to really influence their religious affiliation. They're two very completely different types of variables. And they're both basically just asking, who are you as far as the demographics. So you'll never do a demographic with a demographic or a behavior with a behavior. It should always be one type of variable and a different type of variable. This next question, how many people live in your household versus your attitudes towards working in groups? And again, one can make inferences about the idea about living in households with many people and how that might influence their each participant's willingness to work with others based on their exposures at home. For the second activity in the lesson, you'll look at correlations, specifically between unemployment, education, and weekly earnings, and you'll look at some statistics, and you'll answer these 4 corresponding focus questions in your copy of today's Google Doc. This is the data itself. Again, looking at earnings and unemployment rates by educational attainment, and we can clearly see that the unemployment rate across the board goes down with the more education that a person has, and the weekly earnings tends to go up with the more education that a person has. So again, one can make these connections across the board and then say, okay, so what influence does education have on overall earnings and unemployment? And then for the third activity, which you'll start in this lesson and you'll actually complete it in the next lesson on January 13th, is looking at your own surveys, the drafts that you've put together so far, and to begin to consider like what correlations might exist among your own survey questions, really thinking ahead to predicting what the data might actually do in terms of confirming your initial hypotheses, or in some cases, if this happens, that it actually refutes the assumptions that you make. So what you want to do is look at the variables for each of your survey questions and note them in your notebooks on a list. You can either do a pen and paper or you can do it in that Google Doc, whatever is easier for you to keep track of your notes. And then in the graphic organizer, what you're going to want to do is consider, okay, so what are my two questions that I'm comparing? And what's my rationale for seeing if there's a correlation between variable A and variable B? So for example, let's say I looked at, just going back to some of the previous examples, how many people live in my household, or household size as one variable, and then attitudes towards working in groups. Perhaps my assumption would be that people who have many siblings have the exposure to working with people and therefore are more willing to work in groups as compared to an only child who might want to work by themselves. I could also infer the exact opposite from that. It's going to really depend on what the data itself tells me. Once I've surveyed 125 people and have gathered that information, I can actually make those point-by-point comparisons. And then really the last thing that we'll look at in this lesson is considering how finding correlations will help you to strengthen your field research, allow you to answer your field research question, and really help you to build knowledge that does not exist yet and will exist once data has been collected. That will do it for today's overview of this lesson on correlations. Have a great day, everybody.